Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle Show, and I'm your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books in philosophy, and one of which is The Philosophical Equations of Economics. And they're available free for viewing at our website, philosophypublishing.com. Along with me is my co-host and panelist and good friend, Rick Samuelson. Good to see you, Rick.
And you.
Rick graduated from Yale and Wharton and is a venture capitalist out on the West Coast. And the purpose of the philosophical angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. And this week we're going to discuss the totalitarian, why totalitarian governments must try to steal technology. There was a headline on the front page of the New York Times on October 16th, and I got it right here. It was entitled, "The World Once Laughed at, North Korea Cyberpower No More." And it's by David Sanger. Oh, it was October 15th, I'm sorry. And, and it claims that North Korea tries to hack for punitive, military, and tries to steal technology on a regular basis. And the Times reports, according to this article, that it's getting good at it. Well, this caused me to remember that the Soviet Union also tried very hard in stealing technology from the U.S. and other Western countries when it was the Soviet Union. So then it came to mind that present-day China also participates in this activity rigorously. And it would appear that we could make up a preliminary conclusion that it seems that totalitarian governments in general have a proclivity to steal knowledge and particularly high technology. So we got to ask ourselves, why would this be so? Rarely do we see it the other way around. That is, Western countries or democratic republic countries do not in general try to steal technology from other countries. It's possible that it exists, but nevertheless it cannot be to the same degree that the totalitarian countries proceed in this arena of activity. However, it may be that some individual Western corporations try to steal technology of others, but even here I think that's there's not much concrete evidence, and they probably do not do it much, as the motivation for it is really nil. When you compare the risk-reward ratio of it, the risk is very high in being caught, and thus the penalties that would come with it, even if caught by the U.S. government. So the rewards are small and the risk is high, so I see the motivation for it being close to zero. So why would it be that the totalitarian regimes have a tendency and proclivity to steal technology? So let's explore this today. Well, as it turns out, there's a reason why the proclivity develops within the totalitarian nations to steal technology, and it is that the nature of the direction of knowledge within societies deviates from an efficient manner to an inefficient manner with these totalitarian utopian type societies. There are 3 types of totalitarian states. The first type is the classical king and queen scenario. The king and the queen and their relatives and their top enforcement cadres have total control, and they own most of the means to production. And this scenario was prevalent throughout most of history. In this king and queen monarchical situation, the king and queen try to own as much as possible the means to production, and they made it such that society's purpose was to make the king and queen and company, which are the nobles, as wealthy as possible. And they did a pretty good job at it. In olden times, the means to production was for the most part, the land, and so the king and queen and company own most of the land. You can still see that in modern day England, where the king's family, the queen's family, pretty much owns a tremendous amount of land even today. Below the king and queen family and the landowners that supported the king against foreign rivals were the serfs and the peasants who tilled the land, and along with them were the merchants and skilled tradesmen that make up a middle class. The second type of totalitarian government is the king and queen type plus an ideology, and this is the one that is most prevalent in today's world. That is totalitarian plus ideology, and these governments are driven by ideology first and foremost, such as by the ideology of communism. Let's call them totalitarian utopians. The third type of totalitarianism is the benevolent dictator or dictators, who cares only for political power and allows for the people to enjoy an economic freedom, and this is rare, if non-existent today as well as in the past. Of course, there are types of governments that are mixtures of these types, and an example would be the present-day Russia. An oligarchy with the very top profiting from the very big corporations, and below that is a middle class that is free to pursue its production of goods and services. And maybe we could put China somewhat in this category. With the totalitarian utopian government such as China or North Korea, its economy does not develop as fast as the benign totalitarian nor as fast as the democratic republic societies. And this is because of the curtailment of freedom by corrupting the direction of information. Information and knowledge goes from individual to the government bureaucracy and then comes back to the individual, causing a potential for the knowledge and the information to become altered and corrupted. In free societies, such as in a democratic republic, freedom exists to a greater extent, and as such, information travels directly to those most concerned. But at this point, I should point out that we mentioned freedom, so we need to define it. So let's define freedom as is the creation of priorities and the effectuation of these priorities. First, there's individual freedom, whereby the individual creates his priorities and then carries them out to do whatever he wants to do. And then there is a societal freedom, where individuals with the same priority come together to cooperate to effectuate a mutual priority. And the priority will be a good or a service. These are the regular companies that we see in everyday economics. People banding together with the priority of producing a good or service to sell into the marketplace. And these individuals or cooperative company situations, in these situations, the information and knowledge created internally by the individual or individuals with the priority of making the good or service stays within either the individual's mind or within the propriety of information and knowledge of the cooperative company. So in the totalitarian utopian type of government, the individual's information must travel first to the government agency or agencies for processing before it is returned to the individual or to the groups of individuals or to the company for effectuation, which would then produce a good or a service, some sort of product. The problem here is that the governmental information processing is very inefficient. First, you have to travel outside of the individual or outside the company to some other place for authoritarian consideration. On the way there or at the place of consideration, which is exterior to the individual or exterior to the company, the information can become corrupted, curtailed, or altered, or even stolen. And thus there's a huge potential for the information to return to the company or to the individual not in its original form, or even not returned at all. In these authoritarian situations, production of goods and services become further inefficient because the number of individual creations of knowledge, otherwise known, we would call it creativity. The individual creativity to produce a good or service has to flow to a central government processing place. And as the information grows and flows at a greater speed, and as the profundity of the knowledge increases into a centralized government processing place, the centralized place cannot handle all the information coming from the societal members, because all the societal members and their brains and storage facilities for information and knowledge is much greater, deeper, and profound than the centralized government or the totalitarian utopian place of storage and processing. They're not going to be able to keep up with what's happening within the minds of all the people within that nation. Therefore, free societies can produce and handle its new information, which is used to create its goods and services much faster and more efficiently than any utopian totalitarianism. Because over time the utopian totalitarian government will see that it's falling behind in its production of knowledge and technology, its natural reaction would be to go to the free society and try to steal it to be able to keep up. Rick, what do you think of all this?
Well, I would point to one other issue, and that is the rule of law. Because if you steal somebody's technology in the United States and Europe and any other republics or democracies, you're risking suit. And that is costly. And that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Corporate espionage has occurred in the United States. Because of the risks, it tends to take a subtler form. But at any rate, in a competitive economy, you're going to have that phenomenon. That said, punitive damages and so forth can run very, very high. Those checks and balances don't operate to nearly the same degree in a place like, certainly not in Korea or North Korea. And even China does not have the kinds of checks and balances. And beyond that, with the government owning shareholdings in so many companies, it's a much more mixed picture as to whether it's private individuals who actually control a given corporate entity, or it's government, or some combination of the two. And so you don't have the strict delineation amongst competing parties, frankly, competing corporations, that leads to the kind of competition and checks and balances that you would find here in Europe or in some other locations where the rule of law prevails. And without a market economy, you're never going to have, which attracts, by the way, the intellectual assets and has the resources to pay for the intellectual assets required to develop valuable technology. You're never going to have a totalitarian state that can hope to compete with the information and the technology generated by a place like the United States or even Europe, in the absence of that kind of dynamic. Now, China has successfully adopted, stolen, adapted, and developed technology from the West very successfully. One of their best methods of doing this is through their foreign students. In other words, the foreign students studying in the United States. I have one friend who worked at Los Alamos, and you would think that there'd be some sort of policy in the United States not to have Chinese, doctoral students working at Los Alamos, but they do. And he says that his suspicion, he could never find hard evidence of it. His suspicion is that they were there was an agreement when they came over to the United States. They would receive funding for their education or some portion of the funding, and the understanding was they would bring back technology as part of the quid pro quo. Does that surprise anyone? Of course not. Of course not. It's almost inconceivable that China could have developed as quickly as it has in the absence of stealing and or adapting and or adopting technology from the United States. We, in our infinite wisdom, of course, have supported that by accepting as many Chinese students as we have in the name of monetary benefit, because they tend to pay more than local students. A quarter of the class at University of Washington is Chinese. Now, this is a state-run school, okay? A big school, a very big school, not as big as Ohio State. It's a big state school. A quarter of the students are foreign Chinese students. That is an astonishing statistic. And how did this come about? Obviously, they pay more, so they're welcome as from a financial perspective. But under the rubric of ever greater diversity and internationalism found at the universities, it's thought to be good policy. But that we have continued problems with theft of our intellectual property shouldn't come as a surprise, particularly with China, which has such easy access to U.S. educational institutions.
So did you say that there was an actual agreement in place between Chinese students and the Chinese government for that the quid pro quo is the actual payment of money, and for that the students will funnel back information on high technology?
This is the understanding. Not for all Chinese students. If you're coming over here to study art history, you're not going to be signing an agreement like that. But, or even if it's not signed, there will be no understanding to that effect. But the Chinese government does support a number of high-tech students here in the United States, and this does go on. There's no doubt it goes on.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much. And that concludes our this segment of the philosophical angle, and we'll see everybody next week for another episode.